The courtroom air was thick with the sterile scent of polished wood and the unspoken weight of expectation. A hushed silence settled over the gallery, where spectators sat stiffly, their eyes shifting between the judge's bench and the woman seated at the defendant's table. The rhythmic tapping of a pen against a legal pad was the only sound breaking the stillness. A nervous habit of the prosecution, an unnecessary display of authority in a room where authority was already absolute. Pam Bondi sat with a composed expression, her blonde hair neatly swept behind her shoulders, her tailored suit a picture of calculated professionalism. But it wasn't the power of her presence that had drawn so many eyes. No, it was something far smaller, yet far weightier. Around her neck, resting just above the lapel of her blazer, was a simple golden cross. It wasn't ostentatious, not an audacious declaration of belief. It was small, modest even, but in the eyes of the court, in the eyes of a system that prided itself on neutrality, that cross was a statement too bold to ignore. The charge had been delivered with the cold efficiency of legal jargon, a violation of courtroom decorum, and the improper display of religious symbolism in a legal proceeding. A fine, nothing more, nothing less. An amount that meant little in financial terms, but carried implications far beyond money. She had been fined not for words spoken, not for actions taken, but for something silent, something intrinsic. A piece of gold on a thin chain had been deemed an offense. The judge, an older man with a stern gaze and an impeccably pressed robe, adjusted his glasses as he regarded her. He had ruled against her in procedural matters before, but never had their courtroom exchanges been anything but professional. Never had they ventured into territory so personal. But today that line had been crossed. Pam did not fidget under his gaze, did not shift uncomfortably the way some did when their convictions were questioned. Instead, she held herself still, her hands folded before her, her posture speaking of quiet defiance rather than aggression. She was not the kind to be easily intimidated. The prosecution had argued their case with an almost mechanical efficiency, citing legal precedents, referencing policies designed to maintain the impartiality of the courtroom. Justice must be blind, they had said, their voices firm, their reasoning sound. But Pam knew the truth. Justice had never been blind. It had always seen what it wished to see. And today, it had chosen to see her cross as a weapon rather than a symbol. The irony was almost poetic. A courtroom, a place meant to uphold the fundamental rights enshrined in the very fabric of the nation, was the very place where those rights had been deemed offensive. Freedom of expression, freedom of faith, the right to stand by one's convictions. These were the ideals that should have been defended within these walls. Instead, they had been placed on trial. A rustle of movement in the gallery drew her attention. She did not turn to look, but she could sense the unease, the shift in energy. Some watched with curiosity, others with quiet support, and still others with concealed judgment. The divide was clear, though no words were spoken. The judge cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the stillness of the chamber. "The court has ruled," he said, his voice measured, carrying the weight of finality. "The penalty stands." A quiet gasp rippled through the room, though it was quickly stifled by the courtroom's disciplined silence. A ruling had been made, and now all that remained was acceptance. Pam met the judge's gaze evenly. There was no anger in her eyes, no visible indignation, just understanding. Understanding of what this moment meant. Understanding that this was not just about a fine, not just about a courtroom rule. This was about something deeper, about principle, about integrity, about the cost of standing firm. She had spent her life upholding the law, navigating its complexities, defending its principles. But today, the law had turned its scrutiny onto her, questioning the very core of her beliefs. And yet, she felt no regret, no wavering in her stance. If this was the price of conviction, then she would pay it willingly. The gavel struck, sealing the decision with a definitive crack. But though the ruling was final, the story was far from over. As she stood, gathering her things with slow, deliberate movements, she could feel the weight of the moment settling around her. The fight had only just begun, and in that moment, as she stepped away from the defendant's table, Her cross still resting lightly against her collarbone, Pam Bondi knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The murmurs in the hallway outside the courtroom ebbed and flowed like an unsteady tide, hushed voices pressing against the polished marble walls. Reporters clustered in tight groups, their camera lenses glinting beneath the artificial glow of the overhead lights, their hands poised over notepads and recording devices, eager to capture the moment in ink and sound bites. Some whispered speculation about the ruling, others debated its implications, but all were waiting for one thing: the emergence of the woman who had just become the center of a controversy she had never sought. Pam Bondi stepped through the heavy oak doors, her presence sending an almost imperceptible shift through the gathered crowd. She walked with a measured pace, neither hurried nor hesitant, her heels striking against the tiled floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to defy the uncertainty swirling around her. The gold cross still rested against her collarbone, unchanged, unmoved, unhidden. She had been taught from an early age that principle was not a matter of convenience. It was not something to be set aside in the face of scrutiny, nor was it to be compromised when challenged. Belief, in its purest form, was an anchor in turbulent waters, a quiet but unbreakable force that held steady when everything else sought to pull it away. A reporter, emboldened by the charged atmosphere, broke the silence first. "Ms. Bondi, do you plan to appeal the court's decision?" His voice carried the sharp edge of expectation, the kind that anticipated either defiance or submission, with no room for anything in between. She paused, her gaze sweeping briefly across the faces before her, reading the hunger in their expressions. They wanted a reaction, something decisive, something that could fit neatly into a headline. But conviction was not about performance, nor was it about theatrics. It was about something much deeper. "The Constitution is clear," she said, her voice steady, resonant, deliberate. "Freedom of religion is not a privilege granted by the courts. It is a right, one that no government, no ruling, no fine, and no policy has the power to erase." A ripple of reaction passed through the assembled journalists, some nodding subtly, in understanding, while others hastily scribbled notes, already shaping their angles for the evening news. She knew how the media worked. Some would frame her as a steadfast defender of faith. Others would paint her as a provocateur, a figure unwilling to bend to modern interpretations of neutrality. But truth was truth, regardless of how it was spun. Beyond the reporters, she noticed a cluster of young law students standing near the staircase, their eyes filled with something different. Not the detached curiosity of the press, but something more personal, more introspective. She could see in their faces the struggle of a generation caught between principles and pressures, between ideals and the fear of standing alone. She had been where they were once, sitting in lecture halls where theories of justice were debated in abstract, before the weight of the real world pressed against them. It was easy to believe in principles when they were only words in textbooks. Easier still to assume that laws and rights would forever hold firm without effort. But moments like these were what shaped convictions. Not the easy days, not the victories won without resistance, but the battles that demanded a choice. The cross against her skin felt cool, a reminder of why she had never wavered. The law was meant to protect, not silence. And if the cost of defending that truth was a fine, a ruling, or even public rebuke, she would bear it without hesitation. A second voice, this one softer but no less pointed, cut through the hum of the gathered press. "What do you say to those who argue that religious symbols in courtrooms undermine neutrality?" Pam turned toward the journalist who had spoken, a woman whose careful posture suggested she was not looking for spectacle, but for something more meaningful. She took a slow breath, gathering her words, ensuring that they carried the full weight of what she wanted them to mean. "Neutrality does not mean erasure," she said finally, her voice unwavering. "The absence of belief is not the same as fairness. True justice allows for the coexistence of perspectives, not the silencing of one to appease another." The words hung in the air, pressing against the silence that followed. She could feel the weight of the moment shifting, the recognition flickering across certain faces, the realization that this was not merely about a piece of gold on a chain. It was about the fundamental question of whether convictions could exist in public spaces, whether faith could stand alongside law without being forced into the shadows. As she turned toward the exit, she could hear the murmurs resume, a tide of whispered debates and quiet reflections spreading in her wake. But Pam Bondi did not linger to listen. She had a case to prepare. She was not done fighting. Not yet. The courthouse steps stretched before her like a gauntlet, each polished stone reflecting the weight of battles fought within those walls. The crisp afternoon air carried a subtle tension, an invisible charge that lingered in the pauses between conversations, in the hesitant movements of those gathered nearby. Pam Bondi descended with purpose, her heels striking a deliberate rhythm against the cold stone, her posture unbowed despite the whirlwind of scrutiny surrounding her. Cameras flashed in bursts of artificial light, the hurried clicks of shutters capturing fragments of the moment. Her steady gaze, the unwavering set of her jaw, the golden cross that had become the center of controversy. The symbolism of it all was not lost on her. A courtroom, the very place designed to uphold constitutional freedoms, had deemed an expression of faith too dangerous for its halls. And yet, that same courtroom had framed the blindfolded statue of Lady Justice above its entrance, an irony so thick it was almost laughable. A young man in a pressed suit stood near the base of the stairs, a notepad clutched tightly in his hand, his expression carefully composed but betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Pam recognized the look, the cautious hesitancy of someone caught between professional obligation and personal conviction. He had a question to ask, likely one he had rehearsed in his head multiple times, but something in his stance suggested he was weighing whether to ask it at all. Before he could speak, a sharper voice cut through the space. Do you believe this ruling will set a precedent for restricting religious expression in legal spaces? Pam turned toward the question's source, a reporter standing rigidly amidst the crowd, her microphone poised with practiced precision. The phrasing of the question was strategic, meant to invite speculation, to prod her into a definitive statement that could be dissected and debated in the evening broadcasts. Pam exhaled slowly, letting the words settle before she responded. Precedents are only as strong as those willing to accept them, she said, her tone measured yet firm. The Constitution does not bend to judicial preference. It stands, as it always has, for the protection of all beliefs, not just those deemed acceptable by changing opinions. A few reporters exchanged glances, some nodding slightly, others jotting hurried notes, but no one interrupted. The statement was not crafted for headlines, nor was it designed to be inflammatory. It was simply the truth, spoken with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime defending the principles embedded in the law. Beyond the sea of journalists, a small gathering of law students observed in silence, their faces shadowed by the weight of understanding. They had read about constitutional debates in lecture halls, studied landmark cases that had shaped the nation, but here, standing in the wake of a decision that challenged the very foundation of those lessons, they saw theory become reality. Pam met their gazes briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, an unspoken reminder that principles were not tested in comfort, but in challenge. She shifted her attention back to the steps leading down to the street, her path clear, but her destination uncertain. The legal battle was far from over, and though she had faced opposition before, this case carried an undercurrent she had not encountered in previous fights. It was not just about the law. It was about something deeper, something fundamental. The resistance she faced was not rooted in legal argument alone, but in a growing cultural shift, an increasing pressure to strip belief from public spaces under the guise of neutrality. But neutrality, true neutrality, was not the absence of faith. It was the coexistence of all perspectives, the allowance for conviction to stand without fear of penalty. A familiar voice called her name, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see a longtime colleague, an attorney she had worked alongside in past cases, his expression caught between admiration and concern. He did not speak immediately, simply searching her face as though trying to measure the toll this fight had taken. "You're not backing down," he said finally, more statement than question. Pam's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile, a quiet but unshaken certainty in her eyes. "I never have." With that, she stepped forward, past the cameras, past the reporters, past the debates still unfolding behind her. The road ahead would be long, the opposition fierce, but Pam Bondi had never been one to retreat from a fight. She was not defending herself. She was defending something far greater. And she was just getting started. The days following the ruling carried an air of restless anticipation, a quiet tension threading through the legal world as debates unfolded in newspapers, television segments, and digital columns dissecting the implications of what had transpired in that courtroom. Experts weighed in with conflicting opinions, some calling the decision a necessary reinforcement of judicial neutrality, others decrying it as a violation of constitutional rights, a dangerous precedent set under the guise of impartiality. Pam Bondi watched the discourse unfold with the same analytical sharpness she had honed over decades in the legal field, recognizing the familiar patterns of rhetoric employed by those attempting to control the narrative. She knew how easily public sentiment could be swayed, how arguments could be molded to fit agendas rather than principles. But beneath all the noise, the core issue remained unchanged. Was faith in a public setting truly an offense? Or was the mere existence of conviction now considered a threat? The appeal had been filed within hours of the ruling, a process meticulously executed by her legal team, each argument crafted with precision, each motion grounded in unshakable constitutional law. It was not just about her, not about a singular ruling or a single fine. It was about every individual who carried their beliefs into public spaces, about every precedent that would follow should silence be accepted in place of justice. She had been warned by colleagues that the fight ahead would be difficult, that opposition would not just come from legal adversaries, but from those who feared what her stance represented. Some had even advised her to let the matter rest, to quietly pay the fine and move forward without further confrontation. But those voices, well-intentioned though they were, did not understand what she understood. The erosion of rights did not happen in grand, sweeping gestures. It happened in increments, in small, seemingly insignificant rulings, in decisions that appeared harmless in isolation, but, when woven together, formed the fabric of a dangerous shift in fundamental freedoms. Standing in her office late into the evening, surrounded by case files and pages of legal arguments scattered across her desk, she felt the weight of history pressing against her. The framed documents on her wall, copies of landmark rulings that had defined constitutional law, stood as silent reminders that every legal victory had once been an uphill battle. Every right protected had once been a contested ground. The soft chime of her phone broke the silence, a text message from an unknown number appearing on the screen. The words were brief, unembellished, yet carried a weight she could not ignore. "Thank you for standing up. Some of us are afraid to." Pam stared at the message for a long moment, absorbing the quiet admission embedded within it. The sender had not offered a name, had not attached a lengthy explanation, only the raw truth that countless others, unseen and unheard, were watching this fight unfold with hope and hesitation alike. It was easy to stand firm when support was loud, when voices of agreement echoed around you, when the path ahead was clear and unchallenged. But true conviction revealed itself in the moments of solitude, in the nights where doubt pressed heavily, in the knowledge that the right thing was often the hardest thing to do. She tapped a response, her fingers steady against the screen. "Fear is the tool of those who would silence you. Stand firm. You are not alone." The message sent, disappearing into the digital void, but she knew its impact was far greater than the exchange itself. Turning back to the stack of legal documents before her, she picked up the brief her team had drafted, her eyes scanning the carefully constructed arguments, the precise wording chosen to dismantle the ruling that had been levied against her. Each paragraph was a weapon, each citation a shield, each carefully composed sentence a reminder that law, when wielded with truth, was a force that could not be ignored. This was more than a case. This was a defining moment. Pam Bondi had never sought to be at the center of a cultural battle, had never aimed to be a symbol of resistance against a shifting tide. But sometimes the fight found you, whether you were ready or not. And when it did, there was only one choice: to stand. She closed the folder with a resolute snap, the sound final, decisive. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, every seat filled, every inch of standing space occupied by those who had come not just to witness a legal proceeding, but to bear witness to something greater, a test of principle in a system that often demanded compromise. Some had arrived in quiet support, their eyes steady with conviction, while others observed with cautious detachment, waiting to see whether the weight of legal precedent would bend or hold firm. Pam Bondi sat at the defendant's table once more, her hands folded neatly before her, her demeanor unchanged despite the heightened stakes. The golden cross still rested against her collarbone, its presence unchanged by the storm that had swirled around it. She had not removed it, had not hidden it, had not allowed the pressure of scrutiny to chip away at the silent declaration of belief it represented. The judge presiding over the appeal, a woman of formidable intellect with decades of experience in constitutional law, adjusted her glasses as she scanned the documents before her. Unlike the first judge, who had ruled swiftly and without much deliberation, this one carried the weight of understanding in her gaze, a recognition that the case before her was more than just a question of policy, but a defining moment for the rights enshrined in the nation's founding documents. Pam's legal team had presented their arguments with unwavering clarity, citing the very foundations of constitutional law, dissecting the flawed reasoning of the original ruling, exposing the dangers of allowing neutrality to be weaponized against belief. They had not framed the case as one of defiance, nor had they sought to turn it into a spectacle of resistance. They had simply told the truth, that the suppression of faith in public spaces was not an act of fairness, but of discrimination by another name. The opposing counsel, bolstered by voices that saw the ruling as a step toward a more secular judiciary, had argued that no individual should impose personal beliefs upon a system meant to remain impartial. They had framed their position as one of protection, insisting that restrictions were necessary to maintain the sanctity of the court. But in doing so, they had revealed their contradiction, for in their attempt to remove belief from the equation, they had imposed a belief of their own. The judge took a long pause before speaking, her fingers resting lightly against the polished wood of the bench, her eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on Pam. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet gravity that commanded attention. This court finds that the previous ruling erred in its interpretation of neutrality, she said, her tone measured yet resolute. A symbol of faith worn by an individual does not constitute an endorsement of belief by the judiciary itself, nor does it impede the function of the court. The principle of neutrality exists to protect freedom, not to suppress it. The words hung in the air for a long moment, the weight of their meaning sinking in before the full realization rippled through the room. A ruling overturned, a precedent set, a line drawn not in ink, but in principle. Pam closed her eyes briefly, exhaling slowly, allowing the tension that had sat coiled within her to release. She had known the truth all along, had understood that the battle was never about a single fine, a single ruling, or a single courtroom. It had been about ensuring that no precedent would be set to silence belief, that no ruling would stand to dictate what could or could not be carried within the hearts of those who sought justice. As she rose from her seat, turning toward the gallery, she saw the quiet expressions of those who had followed the case with anxious hope. Some offered nods of understanding, others murmured in approval, but it was the few who stood in the back, the law students who had watched every moment unfold with the realization that the law was not a static entity, but a living, breathing force shaped by those who dared to challenge it, who held her gaze the longest. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes and a carefully held composure, met Pam's gaze with something close to reverence before offering a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was the kind of expression that spoke of understanding, of newfound certainty, of the knowledge that battles worth fighting were never waged for the sake of one, but for the sake of all who followed. As Pam stepped into the cool air outside the courthouse, feeling the weight of the past weeks settle into something lighter, something earned, she knew that the battle would not be the last. There would be new challenges, new voices demanding silence, new pressures to conform to shifting expectations. But today she had stood, and because she had stood, others would find the courage to do the same. As the crowd dispersed, as reporters turned their attention elsewhere, as the city moved forward in its ceaseless rhythm, Pam Bondi reached up, fingers brushing lightly against the golden cross that had never wavered from its place. It remained where it had always been, and so did she.